One tiny spark becomes a night of blazing suspense. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 22. It's the summer, and normally we like to relax a bit with our format. In past summers, if you've listened to us, we've done summers of sci-fi. We did a summer of blockbusters. We usually indulge in some lighter fare. So this summer, we have decided to continue that trend, and we are watching 70s disaster movies as a kind of escape. So join us for this episode as we discuss the Towering Inferno. So before we get into our discussion about the Towering Inferno, so far in our summer of disaster, we have watched the Poseidon Adventure and we have watched Airport. And while Airport is kind of seen as the granddaddy of 70s disaster films because it came out in 1970 and kind of created a pattern for disaster films, though as we discovered last time, it failed Lisa's guidelines for disaster movies. So maybe the other disaster movies improved upon it rather than copying Airport per se. But the Poseidon Adventure and the Towering Inferno are pretty much seen, I think we could say, as maybe the two most well-known disaster movies. I feel like when people talk about 70s disaster films or 70s kind of blockbustery type films, even though it was pre-blockbuster, the Towering Inferno and the Poseidon Adventure are two movies that seem to come to people's minds. And they shared the same producer, Irwin Allen, who was very much into, he shot the action scenes in Towering Inferno and I think Poseidon Adventure. So maybe they just move a little faster, have a little bit more going on than say what we discovered in Airport. But we wanted to make sure that we covered the Towering Inferno in this series just so we could get, I think, a couple more takes, I guess, on the more well-known disaster films. Now, Lisa, I know when we were trying to decide which one we would do next, I remember you said we needed to do Towering Inferno because you wanted to see how it compared to Poseidon Adventure and Airport. In fact, I think we might have talked about it during Poseidon Adventure and Airport that fans of the Poseidon Adventure claim they do more in the Poseidon Adventure, and you had said that you wanted to see not only if the Towering Inferno fulfilled your rules, but also if it compared to Poseidon Adventure in the action department, I guess. So I'm going to toss it to you to kind of get us started with your impressions.
Okay, here are my impressions. All right. Okay, number one, I just have to put this out here. I don't understand why these movies are so long, because this one was 2 hours and 43 minutes, and there is absolutely no reason for a movie to be that long. And I think this is my problem with action movies in general. Is that they tend to just drag them out, and it's the same reason I have trouble sometimes with superhero movies, because lately superhero movies have been doing this, and after a while it's like, okay, I've seen things blow up, I've seen people fight, I'm getting tired of this, show me something else. Now, that being said, I love this movie. I really enjoyed the Poseidon Adventure, but I like Towering Inferno, I think, more. We're not even going to talk about Airport because I understand why Airplane was made now, because Airport is a trash movie. And I think when you put it in like the action category, and I do see why people, kind of put Airplane or excuse me, I can't even say the name of the movie, Airport, as the beginning of this kind of like 70s disaster films. I see why, but I'm glad the 70s improved upon it, because I loved the Poseidon Adventure and I love the Towering Inferno. I will say this, I'm going to get to my rules in just a moment. I want to hear your thoughts first on this movie. But one thing that I noticed about this film is I think this film shares a lot with another 70s, not a disaster movie, but definitely a 70s kind of action movie. And that's Jaws. I saw a lot of like Jaws. I guess this would have been the year before, which we're recording this. It's June 20th when we're recording this, which I think today is the 45th anniversary of the premiere of Jaws. So it was kind of on my mind anyway. At this point in the summer, I like to watch that movie. But because a lot of the horror in this and a lot of the like action scenes are caused when basically politics are at play and people are not listening to the experts. And I like that. I really like to see that in an action film. The other thing I will say about this movie, the Poseidon Adventure, again, while I love it, feels very much like a 70s movie. This, even though there were certain touchstones like the way people dressed and some weird dialogue, once the action started, which was really early on, it could have been a disaster movie set in any time because the special effects were great. I wasn't like aware constantly that I was watching a 70s movie in the way I was when I was watching the Poseidon Adventure. So for that reason, and because I think it is very similar to Jaws, which I love, I'm gonna say the Towering Inferno so far is my favorite. Before I get to my movie rules, Matt, Mel, what did you think of this movie? And do you share my love of the Towering Inferno?
So, Lisa, yes, I do agree with you that of the ones we've watched so far, this is probably my favorite. But there is also a slight but, and that's where I also agree with you that this movie is a little bit too long for my taste. I feel like bordering on 3 hours for a disaster movie is it's unnecessary, if you ask me. And it's a good movie, and the characters are good, the plot is good, and unlike Airport, the action actually gets going pretty quickly within the first 45 minutes or so. I was kind of surprised, seeing the length of the movie going into it, and yet the disaster strikes fairly early. So it's got a good pace to it, but man, it just drags. there's a point towards the end, I guess about 45 minutes from the end or so, where it really feels like, oh, the movie's about to end. Like it's kind of coming to there's at least another half hour or more left. Okay. So, but I totally agree with you that a lot of it still holds up today. I mean, some of it does feel very dated when you look at it, like some of the special effects. I would disagree with you there. It does look a little bit older to a modern eye, but they look good and they hold up. So overall, of the three so far, this one's definitely my favorite. Mel, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the three, this is my favorite as well. I mean, I liked Poseidon Adventure, and I'll probably watch it again sometime. But I mean, I'm a huge fan of Paul Newman, so that could have been partially why I prefer this one to that one. Because Poseidon Adventure, while I enjoyed the plot, the characters kind of grated on me sometimes. Whereas in this one, I like a few of the main characters. And I thought that they did a pretty good job with what wasn't always the greatest script, but it's a disaster movie, so what they're saying probably isn't going to be poetry. But I enjoyed it. I also liked the way they seemed to tap into this idea of, a disaster, something horrible happening, and the government or corporation lying to you to make you do what they want you to do. So, like you said, Lisa, and Jaws, there's no sharks. Go out on the beach. It's perfectly fine. In the Poseidon Adventure, the captain was pressured to go faster than he should have with the weight in the ship not properly balanced because the corporation didn't want to pay for them to take extra time to go back and retire the ship. You kind of had that in Airport, but they didn't connect it well enough to make it make sense. It was the way they weren't funded properly was why they had a runway issue, but it was so blah and didn't really there was no, like, it's not a ship turning over or 100 some odd floor building burning up. So you have a little bit more excitement in these two. So that, I think, kind of unfortunately made it very much like real life, because we know perfectly well when disasters are happening and people just want you to keep partying in the ballroom area and make sure you're giving money to the right political party kind of thing to keep your building going, even if you didn't pay all the money to keep it up to code. So you kind of get all those smarmy politicians, PR people, corporations, that sort of thing, in a building that wasn't even built to code, much less the specifications that the architect said it needed to be built to, because it's bigger than any building could be in real life. Which I have to say, I was impressed for a movie in the 70s portraying a building that tall and it not necessarily looking at first glance completely fake. I was actually like, okay, I mean, I know a building can't be that tall, but it didn't jar me too much to see that. I also thought it was interesting. Sometimes when movies strive to be correct or real, it doesn't work. And this was basically like a dedicated love letter to firefighters and EMTs. There's a dedication, I think, at the beginning and the end, and they talk about how they were trained and how everything was as realistic as it could be in a movie. So I thought that, it didn't feel like a documentary, though. Like, it felt like I was actually watching these people do their job. And this is a little bit darker, I guess. But one of the things I also thought of while I was watching this movie, that we live in a post 9/11 world now. And when I was watching Airport, I just felt so weird about all the people just violating what we now have as security. And, you have the people sneaking bombs on a plane and an old lady hitching all over the world because nobody cares or is paying attention. And partway through this, when firefighters were trying to go through stairways and there were gas leaks and things were blowing up and parts were collapsing, I was like, man, this is a little bit reminiscent of, like 9/11 movies or even like documentaries or whatever. So, obviously it's not the same thing, but I feel like in a post 9/11 world, we look at these disaster movies in a slightly different way. And I thought it was kind of interesting along those lines that there were two novels about high-rise fires. One, I think, was The Glass Tower or The Glass Inferno, and it was about a huge, bigger than is possible building. And then the other was The Tower by Richard Martin Stern. And 20th Century Fox and Warner Brothers both bought the rights to each book at the same time. And Irwin Allen said, if you both make high-rise on fire movies, they'll look like copies of each other. People will be bored. Let's work together and make one movie. So it was the first time two studios did that. And Richard Martin Stern's The Tower, which came out in 1973 when the World Trade Center opened, was about a fictional world tower building. That's what he called his. That was near the Trade Center tower. So it was a bigger tower than even the Trade Center towers, and it catches on fire. And I was like, it's just, being a person in 2020, it was eerie, all the kind of angles that were going on, because the film takes place in San Francisco, and apparently you can get souvenirs and stuff related to Towering Inferno in San Francisco. But there was that kind of, to us now in 2020, an interesting parallel to some of the things that have happened since 74. So I don't know about you guys, but that just, like, knowing what I know now about airplane travel and that sort of thing, and some other disasters have happened, it makes me think about it differently. And I'm wondering if, as we watch other disaster movies, I'm going to be doing the same thing, kind of like almost second guessing them, or thinking about how it might be in a quote unquote real world.
Yeah, that struck me both when we were watching Airport and when we were watching The Towering Inferno. It is how different just the world is now compared to how it was when the movies were made. And I don't know if it changed the way I watched Airport, I think, but I was just frustrated with that movie all around. But it definitely changed the way, because I kept thinking, like you were saying, well, that that could not happen. You can't have somebody just running up to the gate as a plane's taking off without without a ticket and having gone through security. And, I don't know how you would have a stowaway, although I just did read, I think this past week, about a stowaway on a plane.
Oh, wow.
Somebody who had, just walked. I'll have to go back and find it so that I'll share it with you guys. But so, I mean, I guess those things do still happen, but it's much more difficult now. And so that struck me. And then 9/11, obviously the events were on my mind, especially early on. And I knew that when they were making the movie that they had the World Trade Centers in mind, because of the dates alone. You mentioned that it was 1973 and 1974 when this movie came out. And so it colored the way I watched it a little bit. If nothing else, I think it maybe added, I don't want to say it added to the suspense of it, but it made the danger seem much more real in a way that, for instance, if you're comparing it to watching Airport, it didn't. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but that was weighing heavily on my mind while I was watching it. I will also say this was a very star-studded movie, and it was meant to be. I mean, they just intended to load this up with stars. And, so you mentioned Paul Newman. I'm a big Paul Newman fan too, which is probably another reason I really enjoyed watching it. Maybe if Airport had Paul Newman, it would have been easier to deal with. But I had Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Faye Dunaway, Fred Astaire. I mean, just Robert Wagner. The list goes on and on and on. But O.J. Simpson is also in this movie. And I really struggled with that as well. Because I kept thinking, why is he a nice person in this? In fact, I guess he's a security guard. But he's one of the first ones to cause alarm when there actually is a fire. Matt, you had mentioned, I kind of want to go back to what you had said towards the beginning. You had talked about how fast-paced this movie was, and I completely agree. I wrote down the first spark actually happened 12 minutes in. So that wasn't when they had a full-on fire or explosion or anything, but you had the first spark of something. So you knew it was coming. And O.J. Simpson's character was actually the one to start calling around and say, we have a problem here. Everybody else was kind of like, oh yeah, it's no big deal. We got it under control. Just a spark. We've got this handled. And that felt weird to me too. That was one of those kind of anachronistic details, kind of akin to Airport, where you just watch it differently, knowing how things turned out. And so that, yeah, I mean, those are two big things that do, I think, color how you watch the movie, but enjoyable still. I guess he wasn't in enough of the scenes to make it too terrible for me.
Yeah, I agree about OJ. But like you said, he is a bit of a minor character compared to the others, and so it was easy for me to kind of overlook it. And there was one point where I'd kind of gotten into everything else, and he showed up again. I was like, oh, that's right, OJ's in the movie. Like, I had honestly forgotten it from the first time he was on screen until later. But it is, I guess it would be, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, no, I was just going to say same. I would completely forget. I would get so wrapped up in whatever the characters were doing, and then he'd pop up and I'd be like, there he is again.
Well, and I guess from my point of view, it would probably have been a bit more uncomfortable if OJ was playing a character that was some sort of killer or murderer or something like that. But since he was essentially a security guard in a thing. I mean, it was very weird to see him and remember, oh yeah, he did kind of have an acting career of sorts back in the 70s and part of the 80s. But Yeah, I guess it didn't bother me, but it was just kind of jarring seeing him and going, oh yeah, there was a time when he wasn't in jail, and you know, um, that sort of thing. But
Yeah, I felt like, and this is kind of changed the subject a little bit, but I felt, from our conversation about airport, I think I'm thinking this and was thinking this when I was watching the movie because we just talked about airport. But we talked in airport about how there just wasn't much going on. And, you had this like urgent music and nothing was happening. And it was hard it was just difficult to take it seriously sometimes as a disaster movie because of some of the romantic plot lines that would pop up and things like that. I felt like in this movie, I was actually kind of paying attention to it as I went through the levels of peril, I guess, that people were in. So I guess and I may be treading on your rules, Lisa, so I won't go too far because I do want to hear what you think about that. But while only like the bad guy died, of course, Richard Chamberlain, who refused to do the work properly, we find out later that the Duncan, the character, the construction guy, had asked people to cut corners. So we find out later that they actually don't have all the sprinklers don't work. Certain conduits aren't insulated properly. I'm trying to remember some of the other stuff. Oh, the gas leaks were because they weren't put in properly. There's like certain things. Oh, the fire doors don't all work. Like they either aren't actually sealed, so fire goes through them, or people can't get through them and they burn up and die. So this dude like just tried to save money in every way, shape, or form. So Richard Chamberlain isn't the only bad guy, the electrician, but he dies because they all start freaking out when they have to be taken out across the in the little bucket across to the other skyscraper, and they tell them they can't get any more people out. They're going to try the big thing where they blow up the water tanks at the end. And so he and all these other people start fighting with each other to get out, and he falls with a bunch of people. Fred Astaire's, Lady Love dies, which just was like, it's heartbreaking to me. I was hoping she would live. The kids lived, but they almost died. I'm trying to think who else passed away. I don't think the mayor made it. I don't think the senator made it. But like the main characters, like Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Faye Dunaway, Fred Astaire, the con man, even the scared, the firefighter who's hanging off the side of the elevator, he makes it. But even though all these people survived, I still felt that there was enough peril that it was a disaster movie, if that makes sense. Because like Airport, nobody died. Even the woman who tried to stop the bomber was just injured. It was going to be okay. And this one, I really felt like anyone, well, I figure Steve McQueen and Paul Newman and Faye Dunaway were not going to die. But I mean, when Robert Wagner and his girlfriend died, I was like, he's like second tier character. And then, yeah, Fred Astaire's girlfriend dies. I felt like there was enough peril in the movie and enough question as to whether they would make it. Even Steve McQueen to a certain extent, because they told him it was a suicide mission at first, that it kept me watching. And when you compare that to Airport, I feel like it makes Airport seem like there was even less going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go ahead, and I have added to my movie rules, my disaster movie rules, by the way, after watching this.
Point of order. Is that actually fair at this point?
It is because we're watching to see how the disaster movie morphs and changes, so my rules can morph and change.
I guess I'll allow it.
No, I agree with you about the peril, and this was more akin to the Poseidon Adventure, in that the peril felt very real and that there were moments that it almost felt impossible, which I like to see in a disaster movie. I like to see them get to a place and be faced with a situation that you feel like this is impossible for this character to get out of, and they still manage a way. Like there were several good moments like that. And like one of them, you mentioned Steve McQueen's character. It was when Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, when he was on that kind of quote unquote suicide mission, and they had been laying the explosives, and they're coming down the stairs, but there's the fire below them. And Steve McQueen's character uses because he's wearing a fire suit and is able to like hold up the fireproof door and push the fire back long enough that Paul Newman's character can run through. And I really liked that. There were several moments in this movie, and probably in the Poseidon Adventure too. If I really thought back to it, I wasn't thinking in this way when I was writing my rules. But I like that because you have to have, and you're right, Mel. This is what Airport was missing, because it didn't have the real, not just peril attached to it, where they really could lose their lives. And you weren't sure if they were going to, because characters did die. But it also, they got themselves into impossible situations too, and still managed to get through. And so I like that. I will also say, and this should have been really obvious to me from the get-go of this, but that, because this was in the Poseidon Adventure too, is where there's some sort of ticking clock. A lot of action movies will have that. Airport did not. Airport was just trying to land the plane. But one of the things with the Poseidon Adventure is, I think at one point they said that the lights on the ship only had a 3-hour battery life. So you realize that at some point, not only are they going to face, drowning, but the lights are going to go out in the ship, and it's going to make it that much more impossible for them to actually make it out, if they're going to make it out. And this had a very similar thing where they were able to say, look, those people up there have about, I think at one point, this was before Steve McQueen's character went up to set the explosives. They said, oh, they've got, maybe 14 minutes. And that's it. And that, I thought, was one of those really nice additions where I was like, okay, like now's the time to add the ticking clock so that the suspense really feels real. And you realize that they can't get all the people out the way they were planning on it. Going back to Simmons' death, that was the most satisfying death I think I've ever seen, because he was such a bad guy in this. But before we get to him, before we get to the bad guy, okay. So I noticed a lot of crossover again with the Poseidon Adventure. There were kids. I feel like in a good disaster movie, you've got to have some children so that you feel like they're innocent lives that could be lost. There always have to be the lovable elderly people, right? Fred Astaire, he was perfect. Those type of people. But here are these are the original rules here. Okay. You got to have somebody saying, don't look down while climbing on something. That was said so early in the movie that I literally screamed. I think that was in the elevator shaft, maybe. There was a woman saying, I can't do this. The first woman to go across on that little bucket seat thing to the roof of the other building, which, by the way, that looked terrifying. She was screaming, I can't do this, the whole way. There had to be a man. What? Sorry.
There was also a fireman who said, I can't do this. Or he didn't use those exact words, but when they were going down the elevator shaft.
Oh, yeah, he was afraid of heights.
Yeah.
Right, and in real life, that's Paul Newman's son, or was Paul Newman's son.
I didn't know that.
I did not either.
Fun fact. There has to be a man taking charge while another argues. I mean, hello, Doug Roberts and Simmons. They were the two like most macho men there. Richard Chamberlain's character and Paul Newman's character. They're waiting. I mean, of course, we knew from the beginning that Paul Newman was the one everybody was supposed to listen to. But you still had somebody arguing. And then I'm pretty sure somebody said, promise me you'll be back. I can't remember if I wrote it down, but I feel like Faye Dunaway's character might have said it at some point. Especially when she was about to get...
I think so, because she didn't want to go on the elevator without him.
Right.
She wanted to stay. Yeah.
Yeah. She basically said something along the lines of, I will leave just so you're not worrying about me, but you have to promise that I'll see you again. So I'm counting it. So all my lines of dialogue were uttered. I was very impressed. And then, of course, you have the death rules, right? So I said you had to have people who die because they don't listen to the hero. And that was almost all the men who went down with Simmons when they were fighting over the seat, because you had Doug Roberts and Jim Duncan both saying, no, we have to maintain order. We have to go in the way we had planned. And they didn't listen, and they, got what they deserved, kind of. There was the one who everybody loved. So, of course, you had, Mel, you mentioned Fred Astaire's Lady Love. She had already proven herself by, helping the children. And then she dies very tragically. The one who almost makes it, I feel like that could be her too. And then we didn't quite have a sacrificial death, but we almost had a sacrificial death. Who fits the one who almost makes it was the bartender too. He was a lovable character. And I was sad to see a statue fall on top of him.
Oh yeah, I forgot he died in the statue. Yeah. I just like Lizaletta falling out of the elevator. I was not expecting that.
Yeah, I kind of knew as soon as they put those women, and at first I thought, if I were writing this, and you put the rules in the movie where because they had said the elevator can only go down once, it only has enough power to go down once. I thought, that elevator is not making it all the way. Like, there's no way. But then I thought, well, they put all the women and children on there. Like, now it has to, because they can't kill all the lovable women and all the children in the film. Like, they can't just take them out. Like, nobody's that cruel. So I wasn't completely shocked when the elevator was just, where what happened. There was an explosion nearby, and then it was hanging by one cable.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't surprised when that happened, because I could kind of tell they were setting it up, but I was a little bit shocked when she fell out. I was like, oh man, that was a hard one. That maybe was the hardest death. So I don't know. Overall, I think this movie, it ticked off all of my lines of dialogue. It ticked off all of my death rules. Yeah, I mean, this is classic disaster. And you're right, Mel, there was absolutely enough danger and peril that I was biting my nails through a lot of this. And there was a good amount of death to make it feel like a tragedy too. Like the Poseidon Adventure, they only had 5 survivors, so there was a lot. But it didn't show you. And in this one, they said, well, at least the death count was, I think they said, under 200. So, but it was one of those things that the way it was shot, where when everybody was down at the bottom and you kind of saw the aftermath, and there were a few body bags out. I don't know, that hit me harder. Like, the deaths hit me harder in this one than they did in the Poseidon, because in the Poseidon you were really just following that one core group of survivors trying to get out. And in this one, I felt like you saw everybody for most of the movie, if that makes sense. So yeah, it felt more massive.
Yeah, I agree. And in particular with the Poseidon Adventure, I mean, it really feels like the bulk of the deaths happened off camera. And so while you get that sense of tragedy, especially at the end when you find out that they were the only survivors of the entire ship, it still doesn't have quite the visceral impact because you're not seeing them die. Like in the Towering Inferno, there's people falling off the building, or Robert Ragnar's girlfriend who falls out the window, basically. I mean, like, people on fire, and I mean, it's a lot more visceral and in your face with the deaths, rather than Poseidon Adventure, where even when, like, Gene Hackman was just about to leave the ballroom when it was upside down and the water comes in, you hear the people screaming, but you don't really see all of them die, and so it's a lot and I'm not saying that we should. I'm not quite so sick, but it does have, I guess, less of an impact in that moment for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if it's because I don't know. I was about to say maybe Inferno feels like more intimate because you're in these small rooms sometimes, and there is more of a claustrophobia to it. But there's a lot of claustrophobia with Poseidon Adventure because you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That's pretty horrifying. Um, Another thing that I thought was interesting with that is, one of the things that we talked about, fans of the Poseidon Adventure said they didn't like about Airport and the Towering Inferno was that people are sitting. So they said, in the Poseidon Adventure, people are trying to do something to save themselves and others. And in Airport, they're sitting there waiting on the pilots to talk the guy down and land the plane, and they're waiting on the folks to clear the runway below. So they're literally just sitting there. And that was their criticism, and I can totally understand that. And then their criticism of the Towering Inferno is that the people are in the building kind of waiting for the firemen to rescue them. And I totally get that. They are waiting for emergency personnel and firefighters because they're trapped in this inferno. But I feel like there was a lot, I don't know. I had never watched the Towering Inferno all the way through before. So when I read that fans of the Poseidon Adventure said that the Towering Inferno people were kind of passive, I was like, okay, and so I was kind of glad. And we decided to watch this one next because I wanted to see. And the Paul Newman character, who was the architect, even though everything was built in a way that he didn't say it should be, he was very knowledgeable. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was always he saved Lizaletta and the two kids. He and the O.J. Simpson character saved the two children and their mother, who was deaf, and she made it down, but the kids didn't. So Paul Newman and Lizaletta took the kids through this. I mean, it was, talk about biting your fingernails when they have to like shimmy down the broken banisters over top of that gaping chasm that the staircase has become. It's just terrifying. You have the firemen saving them in the elevator. You have Lizaletta, leaving the ballroom where the guy in charge told them they were safe and could get out so she could go higher to save the woman who is deaf and her children at personal risk to herself. I felt like, except for the fact that the guy in charge who had not built the building properly, Jim Duncan, kept telling everybody everything was fine, stay in this ballroom, you'll be okay. If that hadn't happened, I think there would have been a lot more of people trying to save themselves or trying different ideas or different things to get out. So I don't know. I feel like Towering Inferno is not just completely people waiting on the emergency personnel to come save them. I feel like there's more of a mix. And I liked that. I liked that, showing us how the emergency personnel would handle the disaster, but also showing us how the disaster is personally affecting these people who are in the building and their choices and the information that they have and what they do with that.
I am curious because you said, you're talking about that, and I agree with, you get to see the way it affects everybody. And I enjoyed seeing the fire department getting to be the heroes of this movie. Of course, with Paul Newman, but that was because he was the architect and he was able to work with them. But I really loved, I want to talk a little bit, not to change the subject too much, but I want to talk a little bit about Richard Chamberlain's character being the bad guy. Because for all of this being a kind of, in a way, the corporation was bad. So that's kind of represented by Jim Duncan, William Holden's character. You see how it affects him, right? You see what is happening to the people in his building. And when he realizes that, it could have been prevented, I think you see how heavily that weighs on him, and how much I believed by the end of the movie, he wanted to make sure that whatever happened in the future, this was not repeated. Like, this tragedy was not repeated. So I ended up, in other words, he could have been the big bad guy of this movie very easily. Because at the beginning, he had some lines of dialogue that I had written down that I thought, well, he is going to be one of the villains, because when he first hears about the fire, he says, well, I don't understand the urgency. I think you're overreacting. And he goes ahead and tells everybody, hey, there's a small fire, but no big deal. I promise you dinner will not be delayed. And he's just, at that point, no big deal. This is fine. But he's also trying to keep everybody calm. And I like what you were saying, Mel, because he does keep a lot of people safe by keeping them in that room for as long as he did, because then they could wait for the actual fire department and the trained rescue people to come up with a plan to get him out, rather than just trying to escape themselves and probably not surviving, or probably, hitting real trouble. Where if you compare that to like the Poseidon Adventure, you completely have just one man leading a group of people and just hoping for the best. You didn't have that kind of, they made it all the way out of the ship practically before the rescuers showed up. But then you had the character of Simmons. So that was his son-in-law, the electrical engineer played by Richard Chamberlain, who was like the true bad guy. And I've already compared it to Jaws and kind of the mayor, just the hubris of not willing to admit that he did anything wrong. And he kept insisting that he had done everything to code, even though Paul Newman was saying that the code wasn't enough, and that he had asked for things that were way, way above standard. But Simmons, he had one line of dialogue that was a little over the top, but I also loved it because he was such a big bad guy. Is he said something I don't even remember why he said it now, but at one point he said, I don't need God's help. And at that point you were just like, oh boy, you are doomed. You are doomed in this movie. But I don't know, what did y'all think about him being this kind of just uber bad guy in the movie, and really being the one where you could lay the blame on him, and he really was not redeemable through the whole thing? I was really kind of relieved for his wife, even though she was sad at the end of the movie. I was like, oh, you're going to do so much better. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Simmons and that whole character.
Yeah, I was surprised that his wife felt so awful. Because, I mean, he did not, well, he was basically hitting on Paul Newman's fiance, girlfriend, whatever she was, like as soon as he showed up at the party, right after he had said hello to his wife. And I think right after Paul Newman comes and accuses him of not doing the electrical work properly, he and his wife talk about divorce. Yeah, I mean, Richard Chamberlain's character is just pretty slimy. I did think it was interesting that they made Jim Duncan less of a villain by the end, because I also thought he was going to be a villain, or it was going to be, well, it was kind of a satire about corporations. Because, when they go in the office and his slogan is "We build for life," and I was like, haha. And then at some point they actually show that, and it's falling apart and melting, like while the fires are going. It's like, yep, that's how things work. So I don't know. It was almost like Richard Chamberlain's character was just a terrible person. He was trying to work his way up in the system to get where Jim Duncan was. And so when Duncan told him, I want to save money in these ways, it's like, get rid of this thorn in my side. I didn't tell you to do it, but you know what I mean? Because he's just like, I got to shave $4 million off this. And so Richard Chamberlain's character figures out how to shave the money off. And he's like, I thought you'd be proud of me, but it ends up causing the project to fail. So I did like the fact that there was some redemption for Duncan, that he was trying really hard in the end to save people. But he didn't start out that way. I mean, he was keeping people in the ballroom just because he didn't want to mess up the dinner and the unveiling of his building. I don't know if it's just because the guy was played by Richard Chamberlain, it made it easier for him to just be a a terrible person to everybody in the whole movie. But yeah, that kind of striving, do whatever you can to get ahead. I mean, he just left and tried to save himself, even though they told him the way out he chose was a poor choice, and almost died. And then was making deals with the politicians to get out early on the bucket, and then ended up stabbing them all in the back. And then they all tried to stop him and they all died. It was kind of almost Shakespearean in a weird way. Him kind of trying to get beyond his position. And yeah, the hubris. I mean, he was like Dr. Frankenstein or something, but in a disaster movie. So I guess he's like a construction worker or something. Yeah, there was this almost like over the top like villainy to this guy. Also, I did not expect his house to be the way it was when he was supposed to be the person in charge of the electrical, and he's got like this huge mansion, an amazing bar, and he's like spends the night with a different woman every night. And I don't know, there was like this playboy type, no one can touch me because I have a bunch of money, I'll just do what I want kind of thing. And I feel like Duncan got pulled back into the real world quite quickly when he started seeing that people could actually die. Whereas the electrician guy is like, this is just what I do.
Shakespearean. That's a good way of describing him. He's a Shakespeare villain. And
well, he even calls himself an electrical genius. Like, who does that?
Oh yeah, yeah. The ego, the hubris, the willing. And I think you're right about it, kind of getting the reading on him is he was moving up in his business, I guess, to become Jim Duncan. He wanted that was his goal. Even you get the impression that even marrying Duncan's daughter was, just a step in that direction. And he was that way to the end, because when he realized that not all the men were going to make it across, he was willing to put the women and children first, with the understanding that he would be following them. And then when he realized that he probably wouldn't make it because his number was too low down, and he just kind of was like, okay, great, you guys figure it out. I'm going no matter what. And that completely fit with his character. Of course, it caused panic and chaos. But he was, even when he realized that the other men were going to take him down because it was too heavy to go across, he was shoving them off with his foot.
I was just about to say that. Like
mean,
he literally pushed one off. Like one fell and one got pushed off by him, and then he fell. Like,
yeah, he was terrible. Absolutely. But kind of in like it was gleeful to watch him be that terrible. Like, it was fun. It was a disaster movie. Like I said, his was the one death that I was not at all sad to see.
nor do I think we're supposed to be.
No. All right. Well, I don't want to keep. I do want to keep talking about Simmons and his death, because that was a fun scene in an otherwise pretty suspenseful action film. But I don't want to belabor that, because that seems kind of mean. Even though he's a fictional character, we don't want to gleefully discuss his death. Well, I will mention a few kind of fun facts about this movie. So the first thing is that this film won 3 Oscars. So Best Cinematography, Best Original Song, and Film Editing. I will say this about the music. Other than a couple of scenes in the ballroom when they were having the party, because there were a couple of weird like 70s songs, the soundtrack to the score did not sound too 70s. So I was pleased with that. It was also, though, nominated for Best Picture, Score, Sound, Art Direction, and Supporting Actor. So I think having an action film like this actually going on to win 3 Oscars and being nominated for several more is a pretty notable feat. It also did very well at the box office. So this was made for around $14 million, which is comparable to 71 million today, but it grossed 116 million, which is 600 million today. So again, star-studded, it paid off big. And I think it's worth mentioning that the director for this, I think you say his name, John Guillermin, I'm not completely sure, but he also did 1976 King Kong. So another favorite there. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I certainly enjoyed watching the Towering Inferno. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. So we're trying to be better about being more active on social media. So if you are on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, come find us, drop us a note, let us know what you think. If you'd like to go and talk to us by something like email, you can do that too, because we do love getting emails. Send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. Our members on Patreon get access to exclusive content, so they get episodes in the weeks that we're off for our regular podcast feed. Or if that's not something you can do right now, and we completely understand, because times are not easy for a lot of us, and if you cannot support us financially, we completely understand. We're thankful for just listening, but if you want to help us out and you can do it, maybe consider rating and reviewing us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us and kind of helps boost our signal just a little bit. Or, just tell a friend, because that helps too. As always, thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.